moon goddess. Interesting. We'll come back to that a little bit later on in our series. So God shows him another abomination. He says, wow, this has got to be the worst. God says, no. There's one that's worse than that. And finally, you get to the worst abomination of all. Notice what it says in Ezekiel 8:16 and 17. So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men. These are the leaders, by the way, the religious leaders. About 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. And he said to me, have you seen this, O Son of Man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations? Notice that sun worship is called abomination. Commit the abominations which they commit here, for they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. In other words, they flaunt themselves and say, God, what are you going to do about it? Sun worship. Let me ask you, is it just perhaps true that at the end of time, this harlot church is going to impose something having to do with sun worship? You say, well, I don't know any church in the world that practices sun worship. Well, I know some pagan religions in the world that practice sun worship, but, any Christian church that openly says you need to worship the sun, I don't know any. But you see, at the end of time, what happened literally in the Old Testament has a symbolic meaning at the end of time. Is it just perhaps true that what's going to happen at the end of time is not that people are going to worship the sun, but they're going to worship on the day of the sun? That came into the Christian church, by the way, from the sun-worshiping Romans. It can be proved historically. And I'm going to show you a quotation from John Paul II where he says that the church Christianized the day of the sun. As if you can do something like that. You say, well, Pastor, it's not the same thing to worship the sun as it is to worship on the day of the sun, or what people call Sunday. Let me tell you that it is the same thing in principle. You say, how is that? Let me ask you, who created the sun? God did. Did he create the sun for worship? No, it's a secular object, right? It's to give us light. So he did not create the sun for worship. So what happens if you convert the sun into an object of worship? What is that called? Idolatry. Now let me ask you, who created the first day of the week? God did. Did he create it for worship? No, it's one of the working days, folks. Did he create the first day of the week for worship? No. So what happens if you convert it into a holy day of worship? It is still idolatry. It doesn't matter if it's an object or if it's a day. Anything that man makes for worship that God did not make for worship is idolatry. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, as we studied last time, God is going to have a people who are faithful to Him that are going to sigh and cry because of these abominations, this specific one that we've talked about last.